In Florida, once America's retirement paradise, dreams of serene twilight years are fading. Beaches, parks, and sidewalks, even under bridges, have become home for many in South Florida. The state's promise of affordable living has crumbled. Soaring rents and stagnant wages have turned Florida into a graveyard of broken aspirations, where a single misfortune can push anyone to the margins, while tourists bask in luxury, dining on $500 meals and sipping wine by the beach. Just blocks away, hundreds sleep on sidewalks, in cars, or under bridges. This is not just a homeless crisis, but a warning of an America where stability is no longer guaranteed. In this documentary, we explore two Floridas, one of opulent resorts and international events, and another where the American dream decays in the weary eyes of forgotten residents. This is not a tale of despair, but a call to understand the stark divide. Are you ready to uncover the hidden side of America's most vibrant state? Join us as we step into a world where paradise and hell coexist, urging us to confront the truth. When even Florida became a wasteland. In the 1980s, Florida symbolized reward. It was the final chapter Americans dreamed of retirement under blue skies, friendly neighbors, and palm-lined streets in towns like Sarasota or Naples. People sold their homes in Ohio and New York to buy peace. What they got instead, decades later, was a betrayal no one warned them about. That dream is now quietly collapsing from within. In 2025, Florida no longer stands as a beacon of rest and comfort, but as one of the most disturbing portraits of societal decay in modern America. Cities like Fort Lauderdale and downtown Tampa are no longer tourist stops. They've become gray zones where police don't enter, and laws don't apply. The screams in alleyways, the stench near boarded-up storefronts, the barefoot elderly roaming among trash. This isn't just homelessness, it's systemic rot. The data is undeniable. Florida's unsheltered population rose by more than 30% between 2023 and 2025. Entire neighborhoods now see tents replacing homes. Meanwhile, violent crime in these neglected zones is up by double digits. Patrol cars circle the blocks but don't stop. Politicians offer band-aids while affordable housing is torn down for luxury condos. This isn't a sudden war. It's slow erosion rising rents, evaporated temp jobs, unpayable insurance premiums. One woman, a 72-year-old former school secretary, now sleeps in a Walmart parking lot in a pickup truck, eating stale cereal and whispering prayers to stay warm through the night. "I never thought this would be me," she said, "but it is, and it could be any of us." From a land of promises to a state of fear, Florida has become the final warning, not because of riots or collapse, but because no one showed up when the silence turned dangerous, when sidewalks turned into shelters, when a hamburger cost more than peace of mind, when the law withdrew, and with it, the last illusion of safety. Because if even Florida is no longer Florida, then what, truly, is left? The paradise illusion. Right in the beating heart of sun-drenched Florida, where beaches gleam and resorts stretch endlessly, a shadow is crawling in, unseen by tourists sipping cocktails just blocks away. Behind the palm trees and pastel facades lies something far more chilling, a parallel world, where the American dream has soured into a quiet nightmare. Florida now shelters over 31,000 people without permanent housing. But this is not about laziness or addiction. This is about a society that quietly priced its own citizens out of existence. Take a single wrong turn off the tourist route, and you'll see it. Tents under overpasses, families living out of cars, elderly couples lining up behind dumpsters hoping for leftover meals. It's not a failure of effort, it's a failure of systems. Rent prices have exploded. Wages haven't kept pace. Assistance programs are frozen or so narrowly defined they exclude those in greatest need. Angelia Woods is one of them. Once a senior accountant for Florida's own Department of Transportation, she now sleeps with her 4 children in a cramped motel room, paying nearly $2,000 a month just to keep a roof overhead. She earns too much to qualify for help, but not enough to afford an apartment deposit. Her story isn't rare anymore, it's the new normal. Around Florida's shopping centers and glittering attractions, makeshift encampments rise like bruises on a failing system, and in some areas, even police dare not step in, not from neglect, but from knowing control is no longer possible. While cities spend billions attracting foreign visitors and hosting grand festivals, funding for shelters and housing is quietly gutted. Homeless encampments are swept away before international events, not out of compassion, but to avoid embarrassment. This isn't just urban poverty, it's social erasure. A growing class of Americans workers, taxpayers, parents have slipped out of the public eye and into invisibility. They are no longer part of the story of growth, and in erasing them, the system erases its own humanity. If even the land of sunshine has been consumed by this spreading darkness, then what's left of paradise? Miami's mirage, the city of sunlight and shadows. They call Miami a paradise, and from the air, it certainly looks like one sapphire waters, glittering high-rises, palm trees swaying in perfect rhythm. But shift your gaze downward, away from the glossy skyline, and a different city reveals itself. On street corners beneath the condos, tents bloom across parking lots, people curl up beside trash bags for warmth, and somewhere nearby, a child cries not out of tantrum, but hunger. This is Miami too, a paradise sitting on the ledge of collapse. Nowhere in America is the divide between image and reality more jarring. Miami throws lavish fashion weeks, hosts global investors, and serves $500 seafood dinners by candlelight. But just a few blocks inland, nearly 9,000 people in downtown and Overtown have no roof, no bathroom, and no protection from the heat or violence. Some blocks are so unstable that even the police only enter under duress because what awaits them isn't crime, but a level of human despair that no badge can solve. This didn't happen overnight, it happened by design. Miami has poured millions into beautifying tourist zones, repainting facades, and staging world-class festivals. But behind the curtains, funding for affordable housing, addiction treatment, and relocation programs has been stripped away. The unhoused aren't helped, they're hidden, moved along like clutter before a party. Residents say it clearly Miami is for those with money or connections. The rest veterans, displaced mothers, disabled workers exist in the shadows, erased from the city's image-building narrative. Bureaucrats call it urban order. But to those sleeping on the concrete, it feels more like exile. No city can be called world-class while allowing its own to rot in silence. A place that lets an old soldier lie under a freeway while showcasing designer yachts to the world is not paradise, it's performance. And if Miami is just painting over its wounds with sunlight, then maybe the real question is how long before the mask cracks. Florida's broken dream when homes and meals become luxuries. In the sun-drenched state of Florida, a place once synonymous with affordable living and endless opportunity, a harsh reality is unfolding. You might be working a full-time job, steering clear of extravagant purchases, and living debt-free, yet still find yourself struggling to make ends meet. This is not a hypothetical scenario, but a daily truth for countless residents grappling with the weight of utility bills. Stagnant paychecks, and rent prices that seem to climb higher with each passing month. Florida, long celebrated as a haven for retirees with modest savings or workers seeking a fresh start with a decent income, is no longer the promised land it once was. The dream of affordable living, once a cornerstone of the state's appeal, is crumbling under the pressure of an economic system that increasingly favors the wealthy and leaves the rest behind. A decade ago, renting a one-bedroom apartment in Tampa was manageable for many, with costs hovering around $800 to $1,000 per month. Today, that same apartment commands an average rent of over $2,200, a figure that has nearly tripled in just 10 years. In Miami, the situation is even more dire, with one-bedroom rentals averaging above $2,700, often for spaces that are little more than temporary shelters. Meanwhile, the median annual salary in Florida remains stubbornly fixed at around $45,000. For many workers, this income is barely enough to cover rent, leaving little for other essentials like food, healthcare, or transportation. The math simply doesn't add up. For those relying on fixed incomes, such as retirees or individuals receiving social benefits, the situation is even more precarious. Overtime hours or second jobs are not always viable options, particularly for the elderly or those with health challenges. The result is a growing number of families facing eviction each week, unable to keep pace with rising costs despite their best efforts. The root of this crisis lies in a housing market that has spiraled out of control. Real estate investors, drawn to Florida's booming population and tourism-driven economy, have descended on the state like bees to honey. Entire neighborhoods are being snapped up, with apartment complexes transformed into high-priced rentals or luxury condominiums. What was once a modest home for a working family is now a lucrative asset for a small group of investors. These investors, often backed by deep pockets and corporate interests, are capitalizing on Florida's lack of rent control policies. The state has no regulations to cap sudden rent increases or to require developers to set aside a portion of housing for low-income residents. The market reigns supreme, and it is a market that increasingly caters only to those with substantial wealth. For those who have not yet felt the sting of this crisis, it's tempting to believe that hard work and frugality will shield you from its effects. But the future paints a troubling picture. Will the next generation, your children or grandchildren, be able to afford a place to live as they embark on their careers? Can a single mother, working grueling 60-hour weeks, save enough to move her family out of a makeshift shelter in a parking lot? The skyrocketing cost of living is not just a financial burden, it is an existential crisis that erodes the foundational belief that hard work guarantees a stable, dignified life. When that belief falters, the very concept of the American dream begins to unravel. Compounding this housing crisis is an equally alarming issue: food insecurity. In a state as wealthy as Florida, it is jarring to imagine that a hot meal could become a luxury. Yet this is the reality for thousands of residents. Every day, lines form outside supermarkets, churches, and community centers not for lavish feasts, but for the chance to receive a box of cold noodles, a slice of bread, or an expired can of beans. These are not scenes of charity events gone awry. They are the daily struggles of the elderly, children, veterans, and single parents who have no other options. According to Feeding Tampa Bay, a key player in the Feeding Florida network, 1 in 6 adults in the region faces food insecurity. Among seniors, the statistics are even bleaker, with 1 in 7 forced to choose between buying food, paying rent, or covering medical expenses. This crisis is not the result of a natural disaster or sudden economic collapse. It is the cumulative effect of policy failures and systemic neglect. Over the past 3 years, food inflation has driven the prices of staples like meat, eggs, vegetables, and milk to their highest levels in 2 decades. At the same time, critical support programs like SNAP Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program have faced cuts or reduced eligibility, leaving vulnerable populations with fewer resources. Local food banks, which served as lifelines during the COVID-19 pandemic, are now stretched to their breaking point. Financial donations have dwindled, volunteer numbers have declined, and the demand for assistance continues to grow. Behind these statistics are real people, each with their own story of struggle. Consider the case of a 64-year-old retired utility worker in Tampa. After a workplace accident left him unable to continue his job, he now relies on a modest pension to survive. He lives frugally, cutting corners wherever possible, but the rising costs of rent, utilities, and food have outpaced his income. 3 times a week, he rides his bicycle nearly 10 kilometers to a food distribution center, hoping to secure a meal. Last week, he arrived only to be told that the center had run out of food for the day. "I never imagined a time when a decent meal would feel like a privilege," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. His story is not unique, but part of a larger pattern of hardship that contradicts Florida's image as a land of abundance. The state's agricultural history only deepens the irony. Florida was once a powerhouse of food production, with its fertile farms supplying citrus, vegetables, and other goods to the nation. Yet today, the very workers who pick, pack, and process this food are among the first to go hungry. Farmers, laborers, and their families are caught in the same cycle of rising costs and stagnant wages that plagues other low-income residents. When a society cannot ensure that its most vulnerable members, children, the elderly, the sick, have access to basic necessities like food and shelter, the issue transcends budgetary constraints. It becomes a question of values, of kindness, and of moral priorities. Florida's leaders have largely stood by as these crises unfold. The absence of rent control, the lack of affordable housing mandates, and the reduction of food assistance programs reflect a system that prioritizes profit over people, while millions are spent on tourism campaigns and infrastructure for wealthy visitors. Food banks struggle to keep their shelves stocked. When a state chooses to invest in fireworks, displays, or tax breaks for investors, rather than hot meals for its residents, it risks losing its moral compass. The clean streets and manicured neighborhoods of Florida's cities may hide the poverty that lurks just out of sight, but high fences and gated communities cannot erase the reality of those who are struggling. The question now is what this means for the future, when a hot meal becomes a luxury and a modest apartment is out of reach for hardworking families. What does that say about the society we are building, the American dream? Once a beacon of hope. Promised that dedication and effort would lead to a better life. But in Florida today, that promise feels increasingly hollow. The elderly queuing for a slice of bread, the single mother working endless hours to keep a roof over her children's heads, the veteran relying on charity to survive. These are not isolated stories, but symptoms of a deeper failure. If we continue to ignore these realities, we risk creating a society where survival is a privilege reserved for the few, and the rest are left to fend for themselves behind the high fences we've built to shield us from their struggles. Florida's hidden hell. In the early hours of the morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierce the Florida sky, countless workers rise at 500 a.m. They don their uniforms, whether it's the apron of a server, the badge of a delivery driver, the scrubs of a hospital janitor, or the high-visibility vest of a warehouse worker, and head to their jobs with a sense of duty. These are not the caricatures of lazy opportunists painted by outdated stereotypes. They are the backbone of Florida's economy: supermarket cashiers ringing up groceries, cleaners sanitizing hospital corridors, and drivers navigating crowded streets to deliver goods. They arrive on time, complete their tasks, and pay their taxes in full, contributing to the rhythm of a state that thrives on their labor. Yet, when their shifts end, many do not return to a warm home or a place of rest. Instead, they head to a parking lot, where an old car with makeshift curtains serves as their shelter. Others find refuge under a highway overpass or in a tent pitched by the roadside. These are the faces of Florida's new homeless class, full-time workers who, despite their relentless efforts, cannot afford a roof over their heads. This is not an anomaly, but a growing reality, one that challenges the very foundation of the American dream. For decades, the promise of stability through hard work has been a cornerstone of societal belief. In Florida, however, that promise is unraveling. The disconnect between the value of labor and the cost of living has created a chasm that swallows the hopes of countless residents. A full-time worker earning Florida's minimum wage of $12 per hour as of 2025 would need to work over 80 hours a week, essentially 2 full-time jobs, just to afford the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment, which in cities like Tampa now exceeds $200 per month. In Miami, that figure climbs even higher, often surpassing $700 for a modest space. Even for those earning slightly above minimum wage, the burden is crushing. Experts recommend that housing costs should not exceed 30% of one's income, yet many Floridians are forced to allocate 60% to 70% of their earnings just to keep a roof over their heads. The math is unrelenting, leaving little for food, healthcare, or unexpected emergencies. This crisis is particularly acute for freelance and gig workers, delivery drivers, hourly cleaners, and temporary staff who form an essential part of Florida's economy. These individuals work tirelessly, often juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet, yet they frequently fall through the cracks of traditional support systems. Labor welfare programs, housing assistance, and other social safety nets are often designed with outdated models of employment in mind, failing to account for the precarious nature of gig work in the modern era. As a result, many of these workers live in a state of constant instability, moving from one temporary shelter to another, not because they lack effort, but because the system has not adapted to the realities of today's workforce. The gig economy, heralded as a beacon of flexibility, has instead become a trap for many, offering neither security nor a path to stability. The consequences of this disconnect are profound. Working no longer guarantees a stable life. And for many, it barely ensures survival. The stories are heartbreaking: a single mother working 60 hours a week as a cashier, only to sleep in her car with her children. A hospital janitor who spends his nights in a tent because his wages can't cover rent. A delivery driver who skips meals to save money for gas. These are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broader systemic failure. The crisis extends beyond housing to a deeper question if hard work is no longer enough to secure a safe place to live. What does that mean for the future? For many, the fear is not just losing a home, but losing hope, the belief that effort and perseverance will lead to a better life. When that belief erodes, it threatens the very fabric of society, leaving individuals questioning why they should keep trying. The fraying of Florida's social safety net only exacerbates this despair. Programs like Medicaid, SNAP Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and federal housing assistance have long served as lifelines for the vulnerable. However, proposed federal budget cuts, as highlighted by the Florida Policy Institute, threaten to slash these essential services if implemented. These cuts could strip millions of Floridians of access to healthcare, food assistance, and housing support. The justifications for these reductions often sound reasonable on paper, balancing the federal budget, promoting self-reliance, or reallocating resources for efficiency. But behind the jargon of economic policy lies a stark reality: people cannot rebuild their lives without a foundation to stand on. For the elderly, the sick, or those unable to work, these programs are not luxuries but necessities. Cutting them is not just a financial decision. It is the severing of a promise that society makes to its most vulnerable members. Florida's tax system, often praised for its investor-friendly policies, including the absence of a state income tax, has contributed to this crisis. While this structure attracts businesses and wealthy individuals, it has gradually eroded the budget for social welfare programs when economic downturns occur. The first casualties are often the initiatives that support those without a strong political voice: the poor, the elderly, the disabled. Florida's leaders frequently tout the state as a place that leaves no one behind, yet the reality tells a different story. Without robust support systems, affordable housing, or accessible healthcare, where did the vulnerable turn? Where will the elderly go when they can no longer afford their medications? How will a single parent feed their children when food stamps are cut? And what becomes of a worker who has dedicated 40 years to their craft? Only to face eviction in their twilight years, Florida was once a beacon of opportunity, a place where retirees envisioned leisurely afternoons on sunlit porches, where young people came to build new lives, and where working families could settle with manageable expenses. That vision is fading, replaced by a landscape of makeshift tents, overcrowded food banks, and eviction notices signed in sterile boardrooms. The homelessness crisis is not a temporary blip caused by economic shocks. It is a structural failure that has been decades in the making. Reports indicate that Florida is losing its appeal as a place to live, with young people, workers, and even the middle class quietly leaving the state. They are not leaving because they no longer love Florida's beaches or its vibrant culture. They are leaving because survival has become untenable. The cost of living has outpaced wages, and the social safety net is too tattered to catch those who fall. This exodus is a wake-up call, not just for Florida, but for the nation as a whole. Florida is a mirror reflecting the cracks in the values that once held American society together. When housing is treated as a privilege rather than a fundamental right, when welfare is framed as a burden rather than a shared responsibility, and when the poor are blamed for systemic failures rather than protected from them, the consequences are profound. The most alarming aspect of this crisis is its gradual, almost invisible progression. There is no single catastrophic event, no hurricane, no war, no plague that has brought Florida to this point. Instead, it is the slow accumulation of indifferent policy decisions, unchecked inflation, and a growing disregard for those on the margins. Each missed meal, each lost home, each person erased from the system is a sign of a society fracturing from within. The contrast between Florida's outward image and its inner reality is stark. Tourists still flock to its shores, snapping photos of pristine beaches and glittering skylines. The state's economy thrives on their dollars, and its reputation as a paradise endures. But beneath this polished veneer lies a different Florida one, where thousands live in uncertainty, not knowing if they'll have a meal tomorrow or a place to sleep tonight. The elderly stand in line for a slice of bread, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. Single parents skip meals to feed their children. Veterans, who once served their country with pride, now rely on charity to survive. These are not scenes from a dystopian novel, but the daily reality for a growing number of Floridians. This crisis demands more than sympathy. It requires action. It begins with facing the truth that Florida's prosperity is not shared equally, that its policies favor the wealthy at the expense of the vulnerable, and that hard work is no longer a guaranteed path to stability. A civilized society is not measured by its skyscrapers, its golf courses, or its tourist attractions. It is judged by how it treats its weakest members, those who cannot advocate for themselves, those who have given their lives to the system, and those who are simply trying to survive. When a society loses the ability to care for its elderly, its children, and its workers, it risks losing its soul. This is not a call for despair, but a plea for awareness. If the stories of Florida's struggling workers stir something within you, a pang of sorrow, a spark of anger, a moment of doubt, then that is where change begins. The homelessness crisis, the food insecurity, the fraying safety net. These are not inevitable outcomes, but the results of choices made by policymakers, businesses, and society as a whole. By acknowledging these truths, we can start to rebuild a system that values people over profits, that prioritizes homes over high-rises, and that ensures no one is left behind. Florida's sunshine may still shine brightly, but for too many, it casts a shadow of uncertainty. The question is whether we will act before that shadow engulfs the state entirely. What do you think about the hidden hell unfolding in Florida? Share your thoughts, your stories, and your ideas for change. This is not just a problem for one state. It is a reflection of the values we hold as a nation. Let's start the conversation. Because change, no matter how small, begins with facing the truth.